Good evening and welcome to this World Leaders Forum with the President of Afghanistan, Dr. Ashraf Ghani. Whenever we are able to welcome back to Morningside Heights a foreign head of state who is also an alumnus, this forum takes on an added dimension for our university community. Tonight is one of those events. On behalf of your alma mater, President Ghani, I am pleased especially to welcome you back to Columbia in this spirit of world leadership and Columbia alumnus. I also want to recognize an alumna unable to join us today, Rula Ghani, wife, graduate of the School of Journalism and spouse of President Ghani. 40 years of marriage. And I'd like to recognize another graduate, my wife of 47 years, Jean Mignano Bollinger, here in the front row. Also, I'm pleased to acknowledge Afghanistan's ambassador to the United Nations, Dr. Tanin. Thank you for being here. At least since September 11, 2001, and arguably for much longer, the most important questions about America's place in the world have concerned our military and political engagements in the Middle East. Afghanistan has been and remains today the center of that engagement. All of the region's salient issues, security and terrorism, human rights and the rights of women, economic growth and opportunities for future generations. All of these and more are being addressed in dramatic fashion right now in the nation led by President Ghani. The Columbia World Leaders Forum was created to provide a place where our university community would be able to hear in undiluted form about the critical issues facing other nations and the world at large from those in positions of authority and responsibility. Its purpose and design is as a continuous open forum for learning, for discussion, and for vigorous debate, especially for our students who will become the leaders of the future. Now, with that in mind, and with our guests this evening, it is interesting to begin by taking note of many of the early actions of President Ghani just after he has assumed office. He is waging a battle against graft and government corruption and purging from the ranks of the civil service those who have undermined trust in Afghanistan's institutions. He quickly made official visits to China and then Pakistan in order to signal the importance of those bilateral relationships. He has enlisted the support of those two nations, as well as domestic partners, in working towards reconciliation with the Taliban, an essential step for Afghanistan's peace and security. He has obtained a commitment announced earlier this week that U.S. military forces in Afghanistan will remain at current levels through the end of this year. And he has succeeded in strengthening his relationship with President Obama. According to reports from Washington, the two leaders found a personal bond, as so many have before, in their shared experience as alumni of Columbia University. Even before his visit to the United States has come to an end, we can see that President Ghani is initiating a new chapter in U.S.-Afghan relations. Whether at the White House, before the U.S. Congress, or the United Nations, or in his media interviews, the President has been quick to recognize the more than 1 million American military personnel who have served in Afghanistan. and to thank them and all Americans for our support. And it is noteworthy, Mr. President, that some of those veterans who served in Afghanistan are at Columbia now, among the hundreds of student veterans we are proud to have here on our campus each year. Surely it is a sobering set of challenges confronting Afghanistan. On the subject of leadership, Winston Churchill remarked that the nation will find it very hard to look up to leaders who are keeping their ears to the ground. In his brief time in office, President Ghani has shown signs of standing straight, demonstrating a willingness to break from the past and to try new approaches in order to build a brighter future for his nation. President Ghani has assumed office with very impressive credentials. He holds master's and doctoral degrees in anthropology from this university. After completing his studies at Columbia, he taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and then Johns Hopkins. He later worked at the World Bank, advising on the human dimensions of economic programs. After serving as special advisor to the UN Secretary General's envoy to Afghanistan, Dr. Ghani led several initiatives in Afghanistan's transitional administration and served as finance minister in the Karzai government. It is not, to be sure, the most typical resume for a head of state, nor is it common for a scholarly organization to convey its congratulations to a newly elected national leader. Yet the American Anthropological Association did just that upon President Ghani's election, expressing the hope that historians will look back on this as an important case study in governance fully informed by both formal social science training and a lifetime of practical experience. Those high hopes are shared, I know, by many in our audience tonight. We look forward to this evening's lecture, and we are honored to welcome you back to campus, the President of Afghanistan, Dr. Ashraf Ghani.
Whenever I come to Columbia, I have to time myself. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, President Bollinger, Mrs. Bollinger, distinguished faculty members, wonderful students, it's a pleasure to be with you again. Columbia is a tribute to what John Dewey established in the public, in the definition of the public and its problems. He asked the fundamental question, what's a public? And his answer was simple and profound. A public is created through debate. Without joining the discussion, there is no public. And I want to pay tribute to my teachers at Columbia University who prepared me for this tough job. I couldn't ask for a better schooling, and I'm delighted that I chose Columbia over Harvard and Cornell, because at Columbia, reality never leaves you alone. Harlem, at that time, the neighborhood was not gentrified. Walking around 112th Street meant if you did not know which block was safe and which was not, you could get a mugging. So congratulations for creating a very safe environment. What I'd like to talk about for about 30 minutes, so then we can go to a conversation in the Dewey style, is to briefly talk about the issue of leadership. And the first proposition that I'd like to put is the difference on how much leadership is thematized in the private sector and how little leadership is actually discussed in the public sector. In the private sector, the consumer is the center of attention. In all, the technology of judgment is how to satisfy the consumer as the person who has voice and choice. This has become an approach, a technology, an enormous industry. In the private sector, accountability to the consumer has been established in layers, and it's become an incredibly well-developed mid-range theory. In the public sector, by contrast, either it's at the level of morality in general, or at very low or mid-range. I would submit and ask for your engagement, because President Bollinger asked me exactly to suggest the topic. Public leadership in the 21st century needs to be taken seriously by Columbia University and thematized and developed. So as an initial contribution, I would like to argue that the citizen must be taken as the yardstick for public leadership and the source of accountability. Why do we need to take the citizen seriously? Because without the citizen, there is no public. In the diversity of the needs of the citizen, the discussions regarding citizenship and the complexity of the subject are what allow us to focus very clearly on accountability. If we take the citizen seriously, then the trilogy that Hirschman put, that's Albert O. Hirschman, still becomes relevant. He put three things centrally: voice. People can articulate their views, and the more democratic the polity, the more hopefully voice counts. And then there's exit, moving out of the system. The combination of the two produces what he called loyalty. And if anything is clear in today's public discourse, is that loyalty cannot be taken for granted. Loyalty is not just given, it needs to be earned. It needs to be earned continuously. Until the breakdown of the Soviet Union, and particularly the falling of East Germany, voice and loyalty were taken as opposition, that either one voiced and therefore identified actively with change of the system or opted out. Because those who opted out actually allowed for certain repressive practices to continue without bringing change. A typical example, of course, was the flight of the middle class from the cities in 1960s. They exited instead of engaging to reform the cities. In East Germany, Hirschman argued, we saw a unique combination of voice and exit simultaneously. One group left on that famous train and forced their way because exit was denied, yet they forced it. And another group joined in open protest. That allowed Hirschman to argue that systems could be subject to fundamental transformation by combining voice and exit. And this allows us to differentiate two types of context and then articulate the nature of leadership by contrast in its requirement. One is a context of relative stability. when structures are stable, when rules of the game have been figured out, when positions are relatively clear and well-defined. United States, Europe, a number of other OECD countries typically exemplify or typify this type of situation. But unlike the theories of 1960s, which took stability as the basic defining characteristics, these systems are not stable. They themselves require continuous challenge. And if you need one example, look at 2008 fiscal crisis. Before 2008, the prevalent ideology between what the state did and what the market did was unquestioned. After the fiscal crisis of 2008, you saw a fundamental redefinition of the role of the state again. And here is what history comes back to play. The Great Depression not occurred and an entire array of institutions had not been built, the world, I would argue, would not have been capable of coping with the 2008 fiscal crisis and its aftermath. And it's not incidental that Bernanke, the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, had done his thesis on the Great Depression. So the point to be derived from here, leadership is always defined by historical and cultural experience. We may momentarily forget history, but it comes back to play as guide and as reference points, but not as the total constraint. So imagination is required in all of these. And if we look into this and why we need to thematize leadership, there isn't a single OECD country that is not facing major issues of leadership today. The electoral politics is short-term. The challenges of leadership are medium and long-term. And it's that imbalance that we are not finding answers to. Because if the problems of inherited from 2008 and before are to be addressed, the public must allow a different horizon. Yet, the demands, exigencies of the moment drive decision-making, and the news cycle's dictation means responding to the headlines of the moment. You can respond to the headlines, but will responding to the headlines define your place in the history of the future is in doubt. How would the public, in these contexts, allow leaders room to think through the medium and long term, and how would the public discourse allow for this possibility or the challenges that need to be confronted and answers provided for? But this was to set the contrast for the type of situation that I face. And this is leadership under conditions of near total uncertainty. I don't know which day of the week I will be holding mangled bodies of children in my arms. I don't know which days of the week women walking to school are going to be murdered. I do not know which day of the month a natural disaster will fall, creating a white shroud around some of my people. So the first test here of leadership is not one of privilege, but one of sacrifice. Henry V put it probably best, once more into the breaches. Sacrifice, no matter how greatly demanded and given, however, is not sufficient. Because, and that's where my mooring at Columbia comes, knowledge and judgment are required. Let's take a term that I've recently coined, the ecology of terror. The discussion of terror, prior to this formulation that I offered in Munich some weeks ago, is as a moral aberration, and it's true. But we are not going to understand terror sociologically unless we understand it as a system. And the ecology of terror means that it's a system that is both symbiotic and competitive. In ecological systems, boundaries are not defined by political lines on a map. It defines an ecosystem. It's expanding or it's retreating. I'll just give you one example. There was a young kid in early 1960s that went to Hawaii from California, brought a lizard. No one understood it, neither parents nor the customs agent, because the kid was just too nice. In 5 years, the lizard had become an epidemic in the new environment. So one must understand this phenomena from a knowledge base. Do we have the tools of knowledge to understand terror as an ecological system? It's going to require a degree of control of our emotions to be able to deal with this. And then it's the question of judgment. How do you judge a challenge? How do you judge something that confronts you suddenly? Here, we must hone in skills to read patterns. System thinking, structurally, is good in giving you the broad picture, but unless we are able to read patterns, we cannot have judgment. And the problem of information has largely been solved by technology, but not the problem of knowledge. So our greatest problem becomes, how do we go from scarcity of information to abundance of information and yet make sense of them as patterns? Daesh, in the media commonly referred to as ISIL, is an emerging phenomenon. With all, I hope, with respects to Microsoft, if Al-Qaeda was Windows 1, Daesh is Windows 5. And I don't say that lightly. Terrorism is constantly morphing, constantly developing new features. It is moving much more rapidly, much more fastly, in a much more deadly fashion than our public responses. Bureaucracies, the best of them, at best of times, are very slow creatures. But the phenomena of networks is fast changing. You're all participants in networks, networks of knowledge, connectivity, and others. But now, take the ugly side of those networks. The ugly side of those networks becomes the ecology of terror, the ecology of crime. Do we sufficiently understand criminality as a global phenomenon? $1.7 trillion a year, minimally, is the global criminal economy. How does this phenomena interact with the other, which is the ecology of terror? So in this context, if you're putting the citizen first, how do we secure the basic safety of the citizen? Accountability, you see, all of a sudden assumes very different characteristics. If the safety of the citizen is a primary yardstick of leadership, how do you make daily decisions on use of deadly force? You're privileged to be living in a context where use of force is retreated to the background. It's there. In moments of crisis, it comes out, but not on a daily, hourly occurrence. But when terror is a daily phenomenon, how do you cope with legitimate use of force? It brings the serious moral issues of philosophy and thousands of years of debate back into the fore. Because to protect and to be accountable, you have to make decisions. But if you overuse force, and if you use it randomly, you again fail to the very citizen, because you're exposing her. Related to this is the priorities that the citizen makes. In a book that I wrote earlier, identified core functions of the state. Because one of the problems that we confront again is, what is a state? Do we confront it in the best of ways? And then he provided an answer that became the launching pad for my definition, which is the 10 core functions. These core functions have evolved historically, but what we must know about the state historically, rather than just analytically, is that it expands its functions, expand and contract depending on social context. And here, the prioritization of the citizen is the compact, again, of accountability. Because the citizen, if the primary judgment in a context of total uncertainty is the very minimum safety, you know that they want health, they want education, they want infrastructure. And all of a sudden, vis-a-vis these, you're back into prioritizing, and prioritization means both knowledge and judgment. In here, the problem of temporality, time, takes a completely new dimension. In a relatively stable context, short, medium, and long are in a balance. Here, you cannot avoid the problem of short, medium, and long, yet my day is living in a house that is burning and simultaneously planning a new 10-story building or 50-story building. If I don't spend 10 hours putting out fires, we will be burning. But if we don't spend the other 6 hours planning for the future, we are going to deny ourselves the opportunity. Are we trained sufficiently in the academy to be able to do the triage of time? To know how time is both a friend and an enemy? How do we balance critically this element? And related to this is, of course, that you have to create the institutional thinking to be able to take care of the short, medium, and long. Because the test of leadership in the context of uncertainty is not whether you survive, but how your society will thrive. And that means going from individual-centered leadership to teamwork. And seeing yourself not as the ultimate decision maker, but as a catalyst for empowering others to make decisions. If there are no rules If a game has no rules, you don't know what you're playing. And there are two types of games classically. Those that cannot be played without constitutive set of rules. Like chess, you have to define the rules in order to play. But the other side is children's soccer or football. You constantly redefine the games. And in this type, institutions means creation of agreement over a set of rules, whereby the play then can become recurrent. The moment you have continuity on the rules, you get the beginning of institutionalization. And that allows you to deal with the problem of temporality. Because institution, by definition, means you've moved from individual-centered charisma to the question of routinization. Routine establishes patterns, and then orientations develop functions or defined so we can perform them. Related to this, if we move again, very simply, the next variable is space. Our first unit, of course, is country. We are used to think in terms of states, nation-states, post-Westphalia, post-16th century, particularly after 19th century and after 1945. That's how we think the world is organized. But that inherited organization is now threatened. Across West Asia, otherwise known as the Middle East, from wrong perspective, wrong geographical perspective, we have the collapse of the states. Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya. It's a series of things. In this situation, geography, again, becomes flexible. And in this flexible geography, how do we deal with regions, with cultural units of civilizations or identities, and how do we deal with global interfaces? So leadership then again becomes about focusing on your country, but in context. Because without seeing the interrelationship spatially with other entities, you're going to miss the boat. Geography is not destiny. Geography is a constraint or an opportunity. Human imagination is what is necessary to define a vision of how spaces fit together to turn into places. Into those, place is a space of identity, a space of sociability and constraints. I've put some measures in order to allow my remaining 12 minutes to be used. So let me return to Afghanistan to illustrate some of these and then close with discursive communities of leadership. I brought the problem of temporality to you, but I want to add a dimension. How the past is present in the present, and how the present will become the future. What do I mean by the past and the present? We have a history of 5,000 years. That 5,000 years defines certain of our predispositions. But the more recent history is 36 years of conflict. In years of conflict, you change. Collectively, we've become a society that suffers deeply from the post-stress disorder syndrome. A young woman last week was lynched by a mob for a very simple mistake. And she was sick. And she kept telling the mob that she was ill, but they wouldn't take it. Because the trauma reacted, the collective trauma reacted in this type of response. So that's the side, that when you're dealing with collective trauma, you need to understand that communication assumes an entirely different responsibility. You cannot just do good. You must be able to communicate and enlist support for your projects. Vision in this context requires public participation. I'm enormously pleased to also illustrate to you the other side of Afghanistan. In the elections last year, we had intense debate. And that's the feature of our contemporaneity. I held town hall meetings across, with 1,000 or 2,000 people, but they were simultaneously broadcast. 4 million to 8 to 10 million people watched each of these. This simultaneity of participation changes the nature of imagination. 36, at the end, in the second round, 38% of the electorate were women. Some of them had never come out of their homes. But the debate turned them from passive participants into active citizenry. And it's in these moments that then you see how atoms become collectivities. So as a result of this, there are no silent majorities in my country. The image from outside might be of a society frozen in time. Actually, you're dealing with one of the most dynamic societies on earth, because there's constant discussion, constant evaluation, and one is constantly under the microscope. And what is their first test? Afghans would like to breed. What becomes boring, the one-dimensional men of Marcuse, is now the desired utopia, where you can walk to school, take a bike around the neighborhood, climb a mountain, ride a horse. These very, very normal activities are extraordinary. So the sense of judgment is to facilitate these activities. So where we've debated and where I've been a catalyst, my colleague Dr. Abdullah and others in this endeavor, is to convince ourselves that we will be able to overcome the past, that the future is going to be different than the past, that we will be able to overcome the violence, and we will be able to create the type of harmony that would enable us to imagine being ordinary. Being ordinary is the extraordinary demand. Spatially, how do we rethink? For 3 millennia, Afghanistan was a roundabout. Toynbee made an immensely useful distinction between a roundabout and a cul-de-sac. A roundabout is a place where ideas came to and spread. Columbia University. All ideas, all corners of the earth, and back to all corners. And a cul-de-sac is where ideas got trapped, where they couldn't move, where people didn't move. In 19th century, transformed us from a roundabout to a cul-de-sac. We became marginalized, a marginal space between empires. Now, our central goal is to become a roundabout again. This means a new set of connectivities. We connect Central Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and East Asia together. Instead of being the center of ecology of terror, we become a platform for cooperation. And that's the travels that you referred to. So the test of leadership in this context, again, becomes reaching out, establishing common language, establishing common interest. And here is what you practice on a daily basis in this university: discourse. Ultimately, we human beings communicate through language. And language either unites us or divides us. And linguistically, it's extremely important to develop, as a leader, the capacity to listen and the capacity to find bridges. Because in finding bridges, you establish this platform of cooperation, a platform which allows us to think together our common destiny, our common humanity, and our interconnected world. So let me conclude by saying that the citizen is front and center to us again. I've articulated why we need to think citizenship in the context of conflict, but also in the context of change from ground up again, and from top to bottom, and from bottom to top, and from sideways. Because without thinking this issue, our vision would remain limited. Our capacity for imagination would be constrained. But if we think this fundamental issue, then we're also forced to come to the key differences. How do citizens differentiate themselves? For instance, women, youth, and the poor, or the three majorities in my country numerically that are actually economically and socially minorities. So if one ignores the question of citizenship and leaves it in abstract terms, one will not be able to focus on these fundamental divergences. But if one is, then the question of gender is not a side issue, it's not a question of choice. It is central to the construction of our collective identities. To be able to create the conditions of parity becomes a test of statesmanship. Equally with youth, 60% of the population of the country that have the privilege of serving is under 30. I've inherited 1 million unemployed youth. And every year, I face the task with my colleagues of needing to create jobs for another 600,000. 36% of the population of Afghanistan lives under abject poverty. And the line hasn't moved a whit in the last 5 years. These fundamental dichotomies within the concept of the citizen force you to think back a range of services, and that means leadership is fundamentally about being a public servant. And I hope that you, who've dedicated your lives, particularly the veterans, will be able to join in this discussion and enrich the lives of the citizens. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. President, I found that an extraordinary talk. I mean, never on this stage at a World Leaders Forum has Al Hirschman, Shakespeare, Henry V, Marcuse, and Toynbee been quoted in the same speech, I can assure you. There are microphones. So if you have a question, please line up at the microphone in the aisle. And we will begin in just a moment. Please state your name and your affiliation with Columbia, if that's what you have, which I assume you do. And we will collect the questions and allow the President to answer them. Mr. President, let me ask a question at the beginning. So I was very taken by the way in which you put together a line of thinking that identified having a sense of the rules of the game to begin with, that only then can you think about institutions, that institutions can then speak to the public, educate the public, respond to the public, and address what you eloquently called the triage of time. And drawing on the history and culture of your society and thinking about those in distinctive ways lead me to have dozens of questions that I would love to ask you, but I have one. And that is to take how we talk about globalization all the time. And I would like to know what you think about the responsibility of the global community to your country and to Afghanistan. We do understand leadership has a global dimension as well as a national dimension. And I wondered the extent to which you could reflect on the responsibility of global leadership for Afghanistan's present and future.
Well, thank you, President Bollinger. First, for the kind words. Second, for the wonderful question. First, just an historical point of reference. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. We're a neutral country. We were no danger to anybody. We lost 1.5 million lives. 5 million of us became refugees. 2.5 million became displaced. Not a blade of grass was left intact. Nobody gave us any chance of defeating the Red Army. We did. But then global leadership went into amnesia and forgot us. So in the critical hour of our need, forgetfulness is what greeted us. The world was all too willing to give us arms to kill ourselves, but it did not find the means to help us reconstruct. Because the space was forgotten and Afghanistan was taken out of time in the global process, the boomerang came in the form of Al-Qaeda. To make the point that today's globalization both has its rules of inclusion and rules of exclusion. The excluded spaces are the ones that now threaten, that Dean Acheson, in his memoir called Presented Creation, described as the half that the world got right. So the first test of global leadership vis-à-vis Afghanistan and others is to think not momentarily, but to think again with this time dimension of medium and long term. History is shown that when an immense amount of force is used in a space and people are traumatized, if they are not helped recover, then it produces second, third, and fourth order syndromes that threaten. So I hope that staying with us at this moment would become part of the global consensus. Yes. Second is, that we are not alone. Diplomacy must assume, again, characteristics of being able to figure the rules of the game regionally and globally. In 1945, certain type of world was imagined and largely carried on. But as we were speaking before here, the generation of GI Bill of Rights is gone. But their notions still define the boundaries of our thinking. We must overcome these boundaries to be able to think through globalization now. Globalization as opportunities, but also as challenges that we must get right. So there is the greater responsibility to be able to think all the connectivity not through syndromes of fear, but through images of hope. And I hope that in creating hope, we can fulfill our ultimate responsibility. The Afghan is resilient. She is endured unbelievable horrors, and yet she's standing on her feet. And she wants to be counted as a proper person with the capacity of voice. And if we listen to that voice and engage with it, I think we're able to change the men who are so much part of the other side of the equation, which is being excluded. They've resorted to unspeakable violence. And we need to contain and find ways of dealing with that violence, not just through use of force, but through inclusionary process.
Thank you for that answer. Let's take 3 questions at a time so more people can have the opportunity to speak. First over here. And make questions and not statements, as always.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm actually an intern at the Afghanistan mission to the UN. I'm a Chinese, and I'm a second-year graduate student at School of International and Public Affairs. My question is clearly related to your comments earlier on leadership. So you first mentioned leadership in an individual context, who should understand the culture and history. And then you move on to talk about a team leadership and then to institution. I'm wondering, is there a sequence that you're suggesting out there? Like first, there should be an individual leadership and then move on to institutions. And I know in many contexts, the United Nations peacebuilding efforts in many contexts are usually operating in an environment that there's no leadership of any kind and no institution of any kind. And the UN capacity building efforts are usually usually don't go that far to produce leadership in a local context. So I'm wondering what's your opinion in that UN efforts of extending state authority.
Thank you. Mr. President, is it okay if we
take three at a time?
Yes, that's good. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm Hariharan from the School of International Public Affairs. My question, first of all, thank you for displaying a very deep thinker aspect of you. It was fantastic to listen to that. My question pertains to leadership and in specific to the current context in Afghanistan, where you have CEO Abdullah. And it's a fantastic, fascinating kind of relationship between the two of you. And it's one of the more interesting human stories which have evolved from the last few months. And given what you have said about leadership and how it has to evolve, in a context where you have two very dynamic leaders, each with their own thought processes, leading a country in such a critical time, how do you deal with that?
Thank you. Yes?
Mr. President, you recently asked for the extension of American troops at the current levels. I'm just wondering what you plan to do as a nation to make sure that next year you don't have to ask for another extension, or if there's something the international community can do other than military presence to aid Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for 3 excellent questions. Let me take them in reverse order. First, this flexibility in time, for which I'm grateful to President Obama and the American people, is to carry the reforms that are absolutely needed so that we can create. We had been living from day to day. And now we must bring perspective to a 10-year issue and create the sense of belief that our vision can be translated into reality. Those allow us to re-examine our security, our development, and particularly to answer the fundamental question: who is going to pay for the functions that the state performs, including security? The international community, we are not going to be a ward of the international community. We have to create the wealth to make sure that it can both be redistributed and allow for these basic functions. So this time is going to be used intensely in order to create those institutions that would enable us to respond. A test of leadership is teamwork. And Dr. Abdullah and I are both privileged that we have overcome 200 years of division. For 200 years, Afghan leaders, when confronted with choice of unity, chose division. And the price for their disagreements were paid by the public. He and I are determined not to repeat this. And so we not only work well together, we like working together. And that means initially we may not agree on everything, but vigorous debate brings us to conclude. And the wonderful thing about holding public office is you cannot postpone decisions. You have to act. If you get it 80% right, it's not like finishing a perfect graduate paper, or worse, probably graduate students again still are on deadlines, a faculty member. In terms of the UN needs renewal, and I hope that it's going to be renewed. It is stretched. It suffers from the syndromes of 1945. It needs to be reinvented in terms of contemporary leadership. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and I had a conversation. Again, I'll be seeing him. He's very keen on this, and I hope that he will be able to accomplish his goal. Yes, please.
Please.
Mr. President, thank you so much. First of all, welcome back to Columbia. Thank you for spending your time with us this evening. My name is Hannah Drummond. I am a political science major at School of General Studies. And I'm actually speaking, though, on behalf of one of the most exceptional military veteran students who couldn't join this evening but had a passion for speaking, and so I thought I would share his question with you. His name is David Anderson, and he spent a year in 2010, 2011 training Afghan police forces. His question for you was really, where do you see your country's police and security forces in terms of readiness, not just in fighting, but in keeping the peace and doing police work? As you can imagine, having spent a year training, he was really interested to hear your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, President. Thank you very much for coming here. My name is Camilo Deria Rivera, a first year with an undecided major. My question for you is, in your speech, you talked about loyalty of the citizen and how it needs to be gained and then continued on. And you also talked about people who are, for lighter terms, very bad, very evil people, but that need to be included into society. Where does the line become drawn where their citizenship into the society is just detrimental to progression, to women's rights, to stopping these kinds of attacks that happen in Afghanistan? And how do you balance out maintaining that kind of loyalty and then continuing to progress society without losing that kind of loyalty? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, President Ghani. My name is Hannah Zhang. I'm a second-year political science student in Columbia College. So as you said, you have a wish that citizens will become the yardstick for public leadership and civic responsibility. As you also mentioned, women make up a huge majority of the Afghan citizenship. Therefore, and you also mentioned that in the last election there was a 38% turnout of women, but you also mentioned just the amount of deaths of women, lynchings. So what measures do you have in mind to ensure that in the future female citizens of Afghanistan can be the leadership, or the yardstick of public leadership?
Thank you.
Thank you for 3 excellent questions. The first and the last question relate. a police that is focused on upholding the rule of law is key to women's empowerment. But more broader than that, we need a profound cultural transformation to come out of our recent history of gender apartheid. Our society had never discriminated against women in the way that it did in 1990s. And that, again, is a very distinctive phenomenon because the Taliban had grown up in madrasas from the age of 5 to 20 in all male environment. So the normalcy of the family is key, again, to understanding of gender relationship. And you need to normalize this. And in that regard, the good news is the youth, is the majority. The difficulty, the bad news, is that the vicious path, the vicious cycle of the past has to be broken. And there are two sides to women. One, all historical work now, and a lot of analysis, is shown that if you educate a girl, you change 5 generations. The counter side of this is if a female-headed household lives below poverty line, generations are condemned to poverty. So economic empowerment of the woman really becomes a fundamental drive. Citizenship without ability, without the cash nexus, remains a pipe dream. Women's unpaid work has to become paid labor. And it doesn't mean unskilled labor. You have to invest in the human capital, and human capital is critical. So what we have, the opportunity now, is to be able to seek parity. And in the last decade, unfortunately, in higher education, this parity has not been reached. So still, the number of women professors are too few, the number of women students are too few. A series of women-centered institutions are critical to ability to function, and in conditions of scarcity of jobs, male solidarity becomes all more important. And one has to understand a lot of history and a lot of theorization of power is through a masculine perspective. And we have to break this historical vice on us. So to think through in 2 dimensions means to think in gendered terms. The other question, the excellent question. I deal with calculus of blood on an everyday basis. 3 times a day, our Chief of Army Staff, General Karimi, is here. He sends me 3 security reports. And the horrible figures, the ones that shakes me to the core, are casualty figures. Civilian, military, police. And that's what gives you then the sense of balance. What is the price to avoid that kind of casualty figure? What is it to see a young man, 19, 20, 21, without arms, without legs, blown up by a bomb? How do you persuade a person of that type to have the will to life? So evil, in moral terms, becomes then a political problem. In peace, acquires a different sense of urgency because stopping this phenomenon is important. But the other is, if you're going to believe in an agenda of citizenship, then boundaries need to be clear. That you cannot, for instance, we have the chapters. The 2nd chapter of our Constitution is about rights. Almost everything in the Human Rights Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is in this chapter, but it's richer. It's richer in that the International Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Human Rights Declaration, does not have mechanisms of implementation. Our Constitution obligates the state to perform these functions. And it's that balance that is critical. So where do you decide the boundary? Is that you're willing to spill blood in order to defend these liberties. And that is both our challenge and opportunity, because you have to maintain public consensus. To be able to protect the public, then the public must mobilize. And here, you cannot just do it with use of force. Voices from every mosque, every village, every citizen become important into a symphony requiring collective action. Without that kind of collective action, again, you'll draw the wrong balance. And I hope and pray that we in Afghanistan will be able to draw the right balance.
President Ghani, you've taken us through, it seems, the entire realm of human experience. We are incredibly grateful to you for coming to Columbia. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats and we escort the President